Hello, class. It's Professor Frank Henry Allah, and this is a continuation of the lecture Neighborhood and Built Environment. So, how does the radiation, or how does radiation impact health? So, radiation is one of those things that we have been knowing about for many years. It's not new, right? And because it's not new, we understand its negative impacts on us and on our healths. And so literally we can measure how much radiation had someone been exposed to, and we are able to recognize and we are able to determine at what level is the radiation exposure too much? At what level does it cause adverse health concerns? So we know that, all right? So going forward, there's the set standards of how much radiation exposure someone can handle versus how much someone cannot handle. And now, what exactly is radiation, right? Okay. So radiation is really it's like electrical field and a magnetic field that really it's really the waves. It's the electromagnetic waves, are literally waves that we can't see with our eyes, but they're flowing through us. We're all exposed to waves, electromagnetic waves, whether it be from the computer screen, whether it be from the lights that are surrounding us, whether it be when we walk outside and purely just the sun rays. All these things are emitting electromagnetic waves, and we're being exposed to them. So everyone's exposed to waves. Now, there's different types of waves, though. There's good and bad. We have the not ionizing radiation. These are very high energy forms of electromagnetic radiation. And then we have the non-ionizing radiation, which is very low. The non-ionization radiation is what we get exposed to on a daily basis. And to really to become sick or to get adverse health outcomes, really what matters is the dosage of radiation. So how much radiation are you exposed to? And we have this term called radiation dose. Radiation absorbed by a person's body. We receive low dose of radiation from our natural environment every day. And we know that high doses of radiation leads to cancer, it could harm the fetus, and it could even lead to death. Okay. So the big issue with radiation is it being in our body and storing in our body and causing these health concerns. So the dose matters. How much you're exposed to matters. The dose rate also matters. So the radiation dose delivered per unit of time. So a dose received over a long period of time may be less harmful than the same dose received all at once, right? So if you're being exposed to radiation and you're being dosed just a little bit over time, you're experiencing radiation just a little bit over time, not as bad. Now, that same amount of radiation that you're being exposed to over time, now imagine you're experiencing all that at once, right? You're taking that full dose that you would experience a little bit over time, you're taking that full dose and you're experiencing all at once. That's more harmful than the little bit over time. Why is radiation so harmful to us, right? Radiation affects our DNA. It affects our cells. And so the functioning of our cells, typically cells have the cycle where they live and then they die off and so forth. But what happens is when radiation occurs, it actually breaks the bonds of our DNA. And what happens is our cells are unable to repair themselves, or they're unable to turn off to stop regenerating. So what ends up happening is, I don't know if you're familiar, but cancer is a break in the system of cell growth, right? So our bodies are constantly producing new cells. Some are dying off, then we regenerate, and so it's a cycle. But what happens when cancer comes about? The cells are just regenerating, and there's no death. There's no degeneration. There's no death of the cell. So now the cells are clumping together and coming bigger, 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 and nothing is turning that off, that mechanism. So that's why you see tumors. Tumors are these big bulges, and that's pretty much what a tumor is. It's just a clump of cells just grew, and there's no off button. So what happens is, with radiation, it also messes with this process, and it takes the brakes off our cells, and they just grow bigger, bigger, and bigger, and it leads to cancer and so forth. So what you have to recognize is that, or one thing you should understand is that anytime on your body you are getting abnormal growth, and that abnormal growth is painless, meaning you're not feeling any pain when you touch it. It might be just hard lump or something along those lines. You should get it checked out because it could be cancer. This is more commonly known with breast cancer. Remember, men can also get breast cancer. And so if you feel your chest and things and you feel a hard lump, you should get it checked out to make sure it's not cancerous. When it comes to radiation, there's different types of radiation, which we already talked about, and we're going to focus on the non-ionizing radiation because this is really what impacts us. This is what we are exposed to on a daily basis. This comes from the sun and also comes from man-made or artificial sources as well. There's benefits to radiation, right? So not radiation isn't all bad. Us as humans require to go outside and get radiation from the sun, because it allows for the production of vitamin D. And vitamin D is really important so that our body can absorb calcium and phosphorus, which is really needed for our bone strength, our bone strength. And it's recommended that you should get at least 5 to 15 minutes of sun exposure 2 to 3 times a week. Overexposure to the sun rays can lead to sunburning, premature aging, and skin cancer. And this is something that we're fighting against all year round. So we're constantly exposed to this stuff. There are other sources of radiation. We already talked about the sun being a natural source, but then there's those artificial sources. These are the human-made sources. So we're talking about tanning beds, we're talking about mercury vapor lightings, we're talking about halogen, fluorescent lights, and so forth. So let's talk about the types of radiation. So we talked about the broad categories of the ionizing radiation, which is the high wavelengths, and then now we also have the non-ionizing ones, which are the lower frequency wavelengths. And so now we're going to focus on now looking at non-ionizing wavelengths and breaking those down into 3 major categories. And this is normally what we experience from the sun. We have the ultraviolet A, so UVA, and this is one that is not absorbed by the ozone layer. So let me take a step back. The Earth, our environment, is engulfed by what is called the ozone layer. It's like a big protective circle around us that protects us from all the atmosphere's pressures and things from outside of our atmosphere. So it engulfs us. And so the UVs from the sun are either able to penetrate the ozone layer or not penetrate the ozone layer. And UVA is one of the ones that actually is able to penetrate all the way through our ozone layer. And this is the one, even though it's the lowest frequency one, this is the one that causes the most harm. It's the one that goes deepest into the skin, and this is the one that we experience all year round. UVB, this is the one that it doesn't fully penetrate. It does go through the ozone layer, but not as much. Some of it is absorbed by the ozone layer or deflected by the ozone layer. So we don't really fully feel the brunt of its effect on us. The ozone layer is protecting us, so only a little bit goes through. So if you look at the figure here to the right, you'll see here's the ozone layer, here's our Earth. Okay, so the ozone layer, here's the sun. UVA goes all the way through. UVB coming up strong, and it begins to be absorbed a little bit here by the ozone layer, so we get even less of it that actually hits us. So it's not a big concern, right? Well, we'll talk about it, but just humor me. It's not a huge concern as of right now, as opposed to UVA. The ultraviolet C, or UVC, this one's completely absorbed by the ozone layer. We don't even have to worry about this one. It poses very little threat to us. But that is, so we're completely fine with that. UVB, this one, as our ozone layer is getting depleted, is becoming more and more a concern. So theoretically, we're not supposed to be concerned about it, but because our ozone layer is being depleted, UVB actually is starting to pose a threat to us. So I want to touch on or introduce y'all to the concept of global warming and climate change. And these are two different terms that often are intermingled, but they're very distinct. Actually, global warming leads to climate change. Okay, so that's something to recognize and understand. So global warming is the long-term warming of the planet's overall temperature, right? And this is not just a US problem, this is a global problem. And what happens is our ozone layer is becoming depleted and harmed by these things called greenhouse gases. Okay, so let's define what the ozone layer is. The ozone layer is a stratospheric ozone layer in Earth. So you think of it like as our sunscreen. It protects us from the UV radiation, which you already talked about. We have greenhouse gases. These are gases that get trapped, that they're to trap heat in the atmosphere, and they're called greenhouse gases. These come from carbon dioxide, right? Doing burning a fossil fuel, whenever you're breaking down wood or trees, or wherever it may be, this is what is released. Methane, similar from transportation of coals, natural gases, and so forth. Even from livestock, we get methane. Nitric oxide is emitted during agricultural and land uses. And then we have this one called fluorinate gases. Fluorinate gases is a broad category of gases, and these come from our everyday household stuff that we use, like to clean and things like that. So global warming has led to climate change, right? So what happens is with global warming is that these greenhouse gases, it's called the greenhouse effect. And so when the sun rays penetrate the atmosphere, right, those UVAs and a little bit of the UVB goes through the atmosphere, they're supposed to bounce back and go back out. So they're supposed to go boom, boom, and go back out. But what's happening is these greenhouse gases are think of it as it's filling the lining of the ozone layer. So when the sun rays go down to try to reflect back up, it's being trapped by these greenhouse gases, right? It's not able to penetrate back through them. So it gets trapped here on this side of the ozone layer, on the side that impacts us. It begins to impact us. And what it begins to do is it begins to raise the temperature, because these waves are coming in, they're hot, they're coming in, they give us some heat, they're supposed to go back out. But what it's doing is staying in our area. It's being trapped by these greenhouse gases, and it's causing a warming effect. And this is where we get the term global warming. And so global warming turns into climate change, because as the climate begins to warm, right, the climate now has to adapt to this new warmth, right, this new temperature. And so we're seeing the rising of the sea levels, because what's happening is these big icebergs. If you ever go to Alaska, you'll see huge icebergs just all around, and the world is beginning to be warm. And so now this ice are beginning to melt and fill into the sea, and adding more water into our sea. So what we're seeing is sea levels rising. Now let's think about the problem with that. Think about a city. Let's take Long Beach, that's built right next to the water. And the idea is that the city is built a little bit above the water. So water levels are here. So we're not really in danger of flooding. So as the water levels begin to rise, the city doesn't rise, the city stays there. And now the city's in danger of flooding. So when you see a lot of areas that typically get very little, you get very little flooding, and now are getting extremes amount of flooding, you ask why. And one of those reasons is because of global warming, right? Climate change. Another thing you see, these natural phenomenons that they only occur during certain seasons are now occurring outside of seasons or longer than normal, like hurricanes and so forth. It's because the temperature is setting them off. Earthquakes, think of wildfires. All these things are happening more today because we're warming up. You know, we got this global warming that has led to now climate change, and that's what we're seeing. But there is hope. The EPA, they say that the ozone layer is healing and should fully recover by 2065. So there's hope. So what is the issue with the whole UVB and ozone layer? I talked about a little bit earlier, but let's talk more about it. So remember, UVB was the one that was barely getting through, right? UVA comes all the way through. UVB, some of it gets absorbed by our ozone layer and only a little bit gets through. So the issue with the ozone layer being depleted is that we're now experiencing more UVB. And remember, our environment is built. So when it was built, it was only built for the little amounts that UVB was coming through and was really built to strengthen ourselves from that UVA. So now that UVB is coming through more, what does that mean for us, right? So the UVB now coming through, we're recognizing that it could cause non-melanoma skin cancer and also plays a role in malignant melanoma development. It also causes cataracts. It has effects on plants, so it messes with the developmental process of plants. It also affects our marine ecosystem. You know, a lot of people don't think about this, but even at the little levels, there's a ripple effect, right? Because we have this what do you call it, the like almost like the circle of life, right? Or you know, this pecking order where certain animals eat certain animals or certain things to survive. The little, it gets eaten by the big and so forth. And so looking at the small level, there's this thing called a phytoplankton at the in the ocean that works as kind of like a web. It's just kind of like at the top layer of the ocean. And this is what like all the little fish eat. And then the little fish get eaten by the bigger fish and so forth. And so what they're finding is that this UVB is actually killing off this phytoplankton. So if it's killing off the phytoplankton, that means that the little fish don't have anything to eat. So that means that they die off. So that means that the big fish now don't have anything to eat. And so they die off. So we see this ripple effect. And so it's also starting to have issues with development stages of fish, shrimp, and crab, and so forth. So it's really starting to affect the food chain. That's what's called the food chain within our marine life, and which is a problem. And also you think about the structures. Remember, our environment was built, it was built to handle what was known at the time. So UVB was not a huge concern. Even though some of the buildings were coated to protect from UVB, what's going to happen now, or what is happening now, is the deterioration of the building is happening faster, right? UVB is able to break down the buildings and things even faster. So it's going to need now to be reinforced. That costs money. And guess what? Normally, the communities that receive the redevelopmental funding are not the low socioeconomic or people of color communities. So this has a really big impact on our communities and can lead to more health disparities and so forth. As buildings begin to crumble, infrastructures begin to break, it becomes a huge problem. Now, let's talk about a type of radiation called radon. Radon is odorless, colorless, it's radioactive, and it's natural. It naturally occurs in our rocks, it's in our soil, it's in the ground below our housing, or just on the ground, just in general. And what has been found is that through the cracks and through the breaks and things of the buildings of houses or anything, it seeps through the floors and up into the housing. And the problem is, because it's odorless, because it's colorless, that you don't even know you're being exposed to radon. So that's why it's important to really get your place checked if you think it's a potential radon exposure, or if it may be, or if it's an older building and there's a lot of cracks in the foundation. It's really good to get it checked. Because like I said, it comes up through everything. And radon exposure is known, or is the second leading cause of lung cancer after smoking. So it's a huge issue in the US. So the fight of tobacco and lung cancer is also could be extended to the fight against radon and lung cancer as well. Radium. Radium is a naturally occurring radioactive metal formed by the decay of uranium and thorium in the environment. So this is also in rocks, soils, water, plants, etc. And so this is really seen in drinking water in the community system, and also private wells. This is also in private wells. And radon and radium is one of those things that at one point it was marketed as a energy drink. So there was a thing called Radiator, and Radiator was a energy drink that was marketed for people to drink. And really, the recognition that radium is really bad for you came to recognition because a rich socialite at the time decided to drink a bunch of Radiator over 5 years. Like, he's just drinking a lot, and it built up in his environment and began to literally deteriorate, put holes in his bones, in his skull, over time. And eventually, obviously, he died. And this led to the FDA in 1932 to regulate radium, to regulate this radio pharmaceuticals and so forth. So this led to that. And so this is one of the examples of how when an incident happens, it leads to something more. So that's what we're seeing here. We see this FDA regulation of the radiopharmaceuticals. What are artificial exposures to radiation? So I think what's interesting here is that one of the most artificial exposures to radiation comes from medical procedures. 48% of the average American dose comes from medical procedures. So chronic exposure to x-rays, like when you go get your teeth or your teeth looked at or whatever it may be, that is a source of radiation. But radiation, x-rays and things are important, right? Sometimes you really need it. The idea here is to limit that as much as possible. Don't go in to do these procedures if you really don't need to do them. Another artificial exposure is the atomic bombing. When the atomic bombs in Japan increased leukemia and other cancers. So here is something that I pulled out just so to get a visual of. Over here on the right, we see the different dosage of radiation and their sources and how much radiation is given off on the left for the sources and how much, and then on the right we see what the causes of the human or so forth, or I'm sorry, on the right it's the same thing. We see the sources of radiation. This whole thing is the sources and how much radiation we're actually being exposed to over time. Here on the left over here, this map right here shows that the different sources of radiation and how much is exposed. So the background radiation, this is radiation that's naturally occurring. This is what's in our environment already. This is the background. And then on the left, this is kind of what is man-made. So you see over here, you see some consumer, like what we utilize us as the consumer of products. This is how much radiation that we're putting out. It's 2%. Industrial doesn't even produce that much. It's less than 0.1%. Occupations are also less than 0.1%. But then over here, we see that medical is a lot of radiation exposure compared. Over here, here are some health risks. We kind of already talked about it, but let's do a little bit deeper dive, where short-term exposure to like sun rays and things like that you get sunburns, overexposure, so you're in there a long time, you get aging and skin cancer. So you see people who are really wrinkled and red from the sun overexposure. That's a sign of radiation overexposure. And also some medications and things impact the radiation as well. They adversely interact with it as well, or increase a person's sensitivity to UV. They recommend that in order to protect your eyes from blinding, that you wear sunglasses that like wrap around your whole face. So that's really important. And then when it comes to skin cancer, which is most common in the cancer in the United States, the two most common types is skin cancer are basal cell cancer and squamous cell cancer. Typically usually form on the head, face, neck, and hands and arms, because these are the bodies that are exposed to UV. The most cases of melanoma, this is the deadliest kind of cancer, are caused by exposure of UV radiation. So melanoma cancer is really caused by UV radiation. So let's just talk about melanoma cancer real quick. So this is the most deadliest kind of cancer. And so in order to identify it, you need to really recognize, do you have a new growth, a sore that doesn't heal, or change in a mole? And what they have is called the ABCDEs of melanoma. And so in order to identify it, if you have a mole that's asymmetric, so I mean not circular, it kind of looks different than the rest of the moles or any other moles on your body, you might want to get a check. The borders, maybe the borders are jagged, not a nice little roundish circle, might want to get it checked out. If the color is uneven, if the diameter of it begins to grow larger than a pea size, so it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, you might want to get it checked out. And then also if it's evolving, so did it change over the past few months, the changings of it, you might want to get checked out. Understanding about skin cancer, anyone can have skin cancer. Really spending too much time in the sun, over the age of 50, it's a problem. And the really thing is to protect yourself, to make sure that you use shades and so forth, and to wear full body gear and things like that. And that is it for this lecture.